Welcome back to another episode of the Extra Literary Affairs podcast. Today, Joey and I will be having an affair with Gaberial Garcia Marquez and his short story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. And before we get started, Joey, I would love to read a short summary of the story. And perhaps, if we would like to, we can dive into a little bit of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's oeuvre and his impact on Latin American and other fiction. But let's start by summarizing this story. And I know this is a story that you and I have wanted to read together for a very long time, so I'm really excited about it. In Gabriel Garcia Marquez's story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, a small coastal town is disrupted by the sudden appearance of an elderly man with large, tattered wings. Believed to be an angel by some, he is imprisoned by the townspeople, who are both fascinated and repelled by his otherworldly presence. The man is subjected to cruel curiosity, with people coming from far and wide to witness him. Despite his obvious suffering, the townsfolk remain indifferent to his humanity, seeing him only as a spectacle. Among the onlookers is a couple who initially sees him as a possible miracle for their ailing child, but ultimately loses interest when the man does not perform any miracles. Over time, the man's wings deteriorate, symbolizing the fading wonder he once inspired. Marquez's short story blends magical realism with a critique of human cruelty, and it highlights the themes of exploitation, faith, and the fleeting nature of miracles. Joey, would you like to share with us any of your experience with Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his previous works outside the story?
So it's probably his most famous work is 100 Years of Solitude, which I have read. I've read a few things by him, but that's the one I think most people know him by, which is a complicated story. Have you read that one?
I have not. I am
Okay.
saving that, but I do know that it's on the short list.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated. A lot of the characters have the same name throughout the generations, and it takes place over, I think, a couple hundred years. And the only person that survives the entire time is the matriarch of the family. It takes place in an imaginary place in Colombia, I believe, because I believe that's where he is from and where he writes about a lot. It's a great story. It's kind of complicated, so maybe if that's your first time reading him, I would probably start with this story because it's very short. It's like 4 pages, if that, maybe like 3.5, maybe. So I would probably start with that so you can get a taste for his magical realism. Well, I don't want to spoil things, so I won't say what I was going to say about 100 Years of Solitude, but it is a great book. It takes time to read it. It's sort of like what we say about Virginia Woolf. You don't want to read it in one sitting. You kind of want to sit and think about it, especially because it is so complex of a novel. And the family tree in the beginning is very helpful when you're trying to remember who everyone is, who have very similar names, if not the same name.
Duly noted, Joey. And my first exposure to Gabriel Garcia Marquez that I fell in love with his writing is The Chronicle of a Death Foretold. And that is a novella that he wrote, which again, so lush, so beautiful, so many characters to keep track of and storylines to weave together, but it was really, really magical. So speaking of magical, Joey, this is magical realism. Do we want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, because of course, magical realism is one of his biggest, what do you call it? Not trope. Oh my God, what am I thinking? A literary device. And he is definitely known for magical realisms. I don't have the exact definition of magical realism.
I have one, Joey.
Oh, you do? Okay, great.
I do. I called one up because I thought it would be useful to ground us. I know what I think it is, but I'd like to have someone else explain it. So, magical realism is a literary style that blends the ordinary with the extraordinary, presenting fantastical elements as a natural part of everyday life. Unlike traditional fantasy, where the supernatural exists in a separate realm, magical realism integrates the surreal into realistic settings without explanation or disruption. This originated in Latin American literature, and we're talking to one of the greats right now. We're talking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He is one of the pioneers in this space, and it is often used to explore themes of history, identity, and political struggle. And I think we will definitely see that in this story that we're talking about. And I was also surprised, Joey, when I looked this up, because I'm like, who else is doing this? It can't just be the Latin American writers. Who else might be doing this? They gave an example of Salman Rushdie, also uses this magical realism. Toni Morrison, one of your
Mhm.
favorites, that also shows up there. And Haruki Murakami also uses this magical realism. So I
Mm.
originally thought this was a Latin American specific literary device, and clearly I was wrong. So it was very good for me to take a look at that.
Yeah, and I think if anyone was trying to figure out, like, well, how do I know the difference when I'm reading something? Because hearing a definition, it makes it clear, obviously. But I think that the easiest way to tell is if the magic is explained or if it is taken as a common occurrence. So in this case, we have what the people think is an angel. I mean, he has wings, so that's kind of called into to debate, and well, obviously, we're going to be talking about that. But I think the more obvious one, if not that, is the lady that's turned into a tarantula, but she still has the head of a woman. It's never explained, how does this happen? What does the magic system look like, which is so often talked about in the high fantasy realms of literature. It's just accepted as fact. Nobody questions it. It's not odd to anybody. It's just, oh yeah, here's this lady who has the body of a tarantula that's the size of a ram, but the head of a woman. There's no questioning. So that's the best way to tell. There's never going to be an explanation. You're just going to have to get over it.
So your explanation is there is no explanation.
Yeah,
Joey,
it's
I
just a
do
part.
love that. It's just not questions. It's like, of course, I am a woman who has the body of a tarantula. Of course I do. And there was a story in this story that explains how she got there. So I do appreciate that as well, but it's not questioned.
We learned why that punishment was given to her, sort of like in Greek myth, like Echo or Arachne. The same thing.
Yeah, that was great. And so, Joey, I went a little bit out of order today. Normally, we talk at length about the author's background, and I just want to do it extremely quickly because having a side conversation about his impact would be really awesome, including his literary love affair with Fidel Castro. So, that also was a whole new dimension to this person's personality and life that I did not know about. Gabriel Garcia Marquez is often affectionately called Gabo. He was a Colombian novelist, journalist, and Nobel laureate whose storytelling reshaped Latin American literature, which we've referenced earlier. He was born in 1927 in Colombia, and he grew up listening to his grandmother's supernatural tales and his grandfather's political stories, an early fusion of myth and reality that would define his literary style in the years to come. As we said, his most famous novel is 100 Years of Solitude, and that was published in 1967. And it is a masterpiece of magical realism that blends the fantastical with the everyday to chronicle the rise and fall of the Buendia family in the fictional town of Macondo, which is modeled on Garcia Marquez's hometown. His works often explore themes of memory, solitude, love, and political turmoil, reflecting the complexities of Latin American history and culture at the time. His writing, rich with poetic imagery and profound human insight, earned him the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1982. Quite an accomplishment. Beyond fiction, he was a passionate journalist and a political thinker, using his voice to critique authoritarianism and advocate for social justice. His legacy endures not only in his novels, but in the way he transformed storytelling itself, blurring the boundaries between reality and myth, history, and imagination, leaving behind a literary universe that continues to captivate readers worldwide. Garcia Marquez died of pneumonia at the age of 87 in April of 2014 in Mexico City. So, Joey, the reason I wanted to take us to his background is that I think it really shows up in this story in a pretty profound way. But before we go there, would you like to share with us your initial impressions of the story? And perhaps have you read this before we did this here?
I have not ever read this before we chose it to discuss. I, of course, have heard of this story as one of his most notable short stories, and it's definitely obvious why people really like it. And I love when it's a really, really short story where it's not flash fiction, but it's like in between, sort of. And it just shows you how great of a writer is. And as I was notating things, I was starting to analyze it at a sentence level because I was like, oh, this is really good because this is what he's doing here. And this is what it's evoking. And this is what he's communicating. And this is foreshadowing. And I was like, well, I can't do that because that's not the point. No, how boring would that be? It's just a line by line for 4 pages of me analyzing every single thing. So again, I think when we say, oh, I was highlighting everything, it's usually because we really like the story and because it's a strong writer. And obviously, he doesn't need to be introduced. It's like saying Virginia Woolf or Ernest Hemingway, all of these really big household names who are authors. I don't really need to tell you how great they are, but I really love this story. And I like that the subtitle is called A
I know.
Tale for Children. I really like that that's the aspect that he was going for. And I don't know if that was the full intention of this story. Anything that I've seen about it, I don't know that it was necessarily for children, but I could be wrong. I really enjoyed it. How about you?
I had not read it before. I've had many people suggest the story to me, and for whatever reason, I just never had it go to the top of the list. So I was very excited when this appeared on our schedule. The thing that stuck out for me, just as you said, I have my paper copy right here, and everything is highlighted, everything is underscored. And I appreciate that you said, well, we can't just talk for 3 hours about every single sentence in the story. And I said, yes, we cannot do that. But what I really loved about the story is that, yes, we knew going in, if you know who Gabriel Garcia Marquez is, there's going to be something interesting. It's going to be very Latin American centric. You're going to be wondering what is actually happening and what is he trying to say in the larger message. And so for me, that was the most thrilling part. And he just has, as you said, beautiful language, weird juxtapositions of different images that you're like, what? Like, why did you choose that? I've read the story several times now, and the longer I sit with it, the deeper the meanings go. So we often say, read the story, straight up read the story and see how you feel about it. But there's a very good chance that as time passes, your understanding of the story may evolve. And I just think that was really evident in this story.
Yes, there is so much to talk about in this one story, which always is so amazing when we read something that is so short. It's not dense, but you could talk about it for a really long time. And I do think that this story could evolve, to your point. If this was intended for children, what are you going to take away as a child from this story? Because it is very whimsical. And what would you take away as an adult? Obviously, I'm not a child anymore, so I can't tell you that. But I think if the intention was that he wanted this to be a tale for children, then we have to use the premise or read through the lens that this is a morality tale, that we're supposed to learn something at the end of this story, whatever it might be. To each person is subjective. But that's typically how children's tales work, like a folk tale or, any type of fairy tale. We're supposed to learn something in the end. It's not only supposed to be entertaining, it's supposed to be like putting some cheese on vegetables. It's good for you, but it tastes good. So I didn't really notice that until my second or third time reading it. And I was like, oh, that's interesting because I talk about this a lot with the status quo. I'm not going to give the definition. I also don't have the definition. You should know. If you've listened, everyone that's listening has obviously listened to every single episode and has written notes about how we say. So I don't have to do that. The status quo is how the story is being set up by the author, and it allows us to understand how this world is going to work. So I just want to read the opening lines. On the third day of rain, they had killed so many crabs inside the house that Paleo had to cross his drenched courtyard and throw them into the sea because the newborn child had a temperature all night and they thought it was due to the stench. The world had been sad since Tuesday. Sea and sky were a single ash-gray thing, and the sands of the beach, which on March nights glimmered like powdered light, had become a stew of mud and rotten shellfish. The light was so weak at noon that when Paleo was coming back to the house after throwing away the crabs, it was hard for him to see what it was that was moving and groaning in the rear of the courtyard. He had to go very close to see that it was an old man, a very old man, lying down in the mud, who, in spite of his tremendous efforts, couldn't get up, impeded by his enormous wings. So immediately we get a sense of whimsy because we have this idea that this house is overwhelmed with crabs so much that they have to literally transport them back into the ocean. So that's going to catch a child's imagination. This is a very sensory opening because we understand there's a stench. It smells really bad. I think every child understands what rotting fish smells like. And then this one line that I particularly highlighted was, the world has been sad since Tuesday. That works for children. Everybody's going to understand that no matter your age and your reading level or whatever, you're going to understand the tone of this story immediately. And I just thought like, oh my God, this is genius because it's such a simplistic sentence. It has 7 words. And I bet he had to rewrite that a million times to distill that much information to that many people of all age ranges to get them to understand this one specific thing. That is amazing.
Joy, I appreciate that you brought us to that opening because it's very, to me, very moody. You get
Mhm.
this sense, it's like it's kind of gray at the middle of the day. You have the smells, you have the sights, you can sort of feel the atmosphere. Everything is sad, the world is sad. It's like, okay, that is great. And the very next sentence, and I want to take you there for a reason, it said, frightened by that nightmare, Leo ran to get Elzalinda, his wife, who was putting compresses on the sick child, and he took her to the rear of the courtyard. So we are set up in this moment, frightened by that nightmare. Well, A, it wasn't night. B, it wasn't a dream. And C, we know that he just experienced it and now he's calling his wife in to witness that. So I thought that was also just an interesting, playful, what's real, what's not real. How is he setting this up for us? But I wanted to go back for a second to your first observation about the title. A very old man with enormous wings, a tale for children. And as the story unfolded, I'm like, this is not a story for kids at all in my worldview. It is very much Gabriel Garcia Marquez saying to us, you people who are witnessing this story and are believing in the miracle of the angel coming down and all the superstitions related to the faith that was both shown and unshown, like I think they were showing the opposite of Christian compassion in this story, that
Mhm.
we are all children, right? We are all in this fantasy world of not really understanding how the world works. That to me felt, in knowing a little bit about his history, that I think he was poking fun is the wrong word. I think he was drawing attention to the fact that, and he does it several times in the story, when he's talking about the local townspeople and their religious faith and they're trying to figure this out, he often refers to them in terms that are not very complimentary. And I'm sure that we will talk about that later. But I just really thought that was interesting to think about. Are you poking fun at us right from the get go by saying this is a tale for children? Or is it one of these beautifully ambiguous stories as we've had in the past? Could be. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's for everybody. Maybe it's for no one. You get to decide.
A kid. I don't have a kid, but I would read it to them. I don't think they would understand like all of the big themes, obviously, but I think they would get the message in the end, and I think it would work as a children's tale. But I do want to talk about the idea of this ideal Christian person, I guess. What are the moral? What is morality in Christianity? We start out with Paleo showing compassion for his own child. So they think that the miasma of this rotting fish is causing the fever of their child. And so they're trying to rectify that by getting rid of all the crabs, whether they have to throw out the dead ones or they have to kill and then get rid of the ones that are now dead. Either way, he's trying his best to clean it up for his child. So we can see that there is compassion. There's compassion for humanity and the reverence for life, whether that is because it's a direct relation to him and he will be able to reap the benefits of that by having a healthy child. Doesn't matter. It seems to be pretty contradictory to what is going to happen in the rest of the story, where there is a lack of reverence for human life, or angel life, I should say, in this case, angelic life. So I thought that was really interesting to start us off like that, to show that this man has the capacity to be compassionate to another human being. So that's something that a child probably is not going to pay attention to or unpack. But it is something that I thought of as like, well, why show us that? Is it because this person is now othered and you're showing us a group? We're going to obviously discuss this in greater detail, but that is a curious way to start this, I thought.
And I love it because one of the things that he says, the man and his wife originally thought this has to be a shipwrecked person. It's been raining for 3 days and it's, soupy weather. Obviously, this person has come to us from the sea. And I love this line. And yet they called in a neighbor woman who knew everything about life and death to see him. And all she needed was one look to show them their mistake. So she gives them the look and she's like, no. He's an angel, she told them. He must have been coming for the child, but the poor fellow is so old that the rain knocked him down. So we are given in the third short paragraph, there is an angelic presence among us. The people in this
Mhm.
story believe that this is an angel. And of course, it's an angel because what other explanation could there be? I thought it was so interesting because even in the story, just shortly after that, the angel is referred to a supernatural creature. They said that they were treating him not as a supernatural being, a gift from above, but as a circus animal to be prodded, to be shown off, to be made to entertain. And when he doesn't entertain them, he really does get relegated. He just fades out of the story. And they're like, the child grows up. I also thought it was curious. It was a newborn child and this very, very old man. Those were the two people that we were introduced to very early in the story. The child grows up and goes to school, and they said he gets his second set of teeth. So, right, all your baby teeth fall out and your permanent teeth come in. I thought that was also a cute way to say it's your second teeth. The kid goes to school, and then we are reintroduced to this angel, this creature, this person, this being. I'm not sure how we're referring to him, who's been in this chicken coop for 6 years now, and nobody seemed to care. And I just thought that was also so interesting about the passage of time. I'm not sure where you would like to go with that, but there's just so much, even just
Yeah.
chronologically going through the story. I'm like,
There is a lot that we could go into, but I do want to point out it's a more interesting story because the old man with the enormous wings is the main character, but not the protagonist of this story, which sounds contradictory to say, but this is not the only example. One of the most famous examples that probably everyone has read, and that's why I'm going to use it, is The Great Gatsby, because Nick is the main character, but he's not the protagonist. We learn a lot about these people, but they're not shifting the story really. So in this case, the old man with the enormous wings. That's what the story's about, obviously. It's in the title. But he is not the protagonist because he is not shifting the progress of the story. The story does not depend upon him to progress. He is just a part of the story. That's why there's a difference there. So it's interesting that he is the titular man, but does not control his own fate in this story. It's up to the other people. And in my notes, I'm sure you saw that I said this reminded me of a Hunger or the Hunger artist, depending on your translation. And that is important if it's the or a, by Franz Kafka, because there is a man in a cage who is put on display. And in that case, we have someone that is purposely doing it, that's self-inflicted harm that they are subjecting themselves to. But in this case, the old man or the angel, whoever you want to call him, is just sort of a victim to this circumstance. He seemed physically fit enough to pick himself up and fly off into the sunset as he does in the end. It seems to take years because obviously, as you said, we start out with Paleo's child who is sick as a baby, and then they end up with their second set of teeth and they're going to school. So a long time has passed. His healing process takes a very long time. And it's interesting. Okay, let me stop there. Because I'll be like, you know what? That reminds me. I want to talk about this thing.
well, Joey, I'm very excited to hear about the other thing that you would like to talk about. But one of the quotes from the text said, and they don't even acknowledge his wings, but his only supernatural power seemed to be patience. He could not speak. He could not understand Latin. He could not, at this point, walk or fly. He could also just sit and be still and be patient, to the point at some point they took a hot branding iron and poked him with it because they're like, hey, we thought you were dead. I'm like, I'm not dead. I'm just resting here. Okay. I just thought that was a very interesting characteristic for the author to give this creature, that while the boy is growing up, the parents are starting a business so people can come by and witness this miracle, right? Getting enough money that they can make a expensive house and not have to worry about money. The angel is just sitting there biding his time. He seems completely unperturbed. There was a few little bits of humor, but there were also some pretty critical moments. So it said that the child tried to befriend the angel and it didn't really work. So the angel was no less standoffish with him than with the other mortals, but he tolerated the most ingenious infamies with the patience of a dog who had no illusions. So I just keep thinking about Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his relationship with the Catholic Church at this time in 1968. I looked it up. Most of Latin America, probably 60 to 80%, were practicing Catholics. In 1968, we had Vatican II, which was the reformation of some of the rules around Catholicism. There was a lot of churn going on. And one of the things, and the only reason I'm bringing this up, Joey, is that one of the things that they determined from this change with the Catholic Church is they no longer had to recite everything in Latin. So the fact that Gabriel Garcia says, the priest comes in. He's like, okay, I'm going to talk to the angel. And he speaks to him in Latin. And the angel just gives him some response in some dialect that nobody knows anything about. And that was the proof to that priest. It's like, this is not the real deal because a genuine angel would know how to use God's own chosen language, which in this case was Latin, which again, I'm poking a little bit of fun of that because I think any language could be a language that would be in keeping with that Christian faith. But they had such stringent rules. And he talks about sending a letter to Rome to get information. And they had like this endless questioning of doctrine of how you decide if he's an angel. And I just thought, and they said they'll send it to the pontiff, who will send it to the supreme pontiff, and then we'll finally get an answer. And I think it was that playfulness or that calling out of the level of bureaucracy in the church that I can't not see this, especially in world events that we have just elected a new pope, right? We're talking a lot about
Mhm.
the conclave and the historical significance of 600 years of tradition that never is changed in that process. I think it's just really an interesting view to look at what perhaps Marquez was trying to get us to think about in this story.
Yeah, I think the priest is probably the most interesting character to me. You would think it would be the old man with the enormous wings. He's not the most interesting person to me because I think that the priest is committing heresy because, and I have a reason, I have logic to this. Okay, so obviously, this older woman who's maybe the person that they go to, maybe she's a midwife or something who would typically administer medical care in a small town or a small village or wherever they're at. So that adds up. But as you said, she immediately walks in and says, "That's an angel. You're silly. How could you not tell? It's a guy with enormous wings. Obviously, it's an angel. Get out of here." Okay. Even though he's sort of described more like vulture-esque than angelic, but maybe it's because of his current physical state. But anyway, so if this is in fact an angel, then there is concrete proof. There is no reason for faith anymore in this world if this is in fact an angel sent from above, a baby angel sent from above, which is what I call my dog Frank. So that makes no sense. Why would a priest not want definitive proof of divinity? Okay, that makes no sense. The definition of heresy is there are two. So the first one would be the obvious one: belief or opinion contrary to orthodox religion, especially Christian doctrine. But the second one is an opinion profoundly at odds with what is generally accepted. So at this point, the town or the village or whatever this area is called here, they believe that this is an angel. So he is already going against the grain to say this is not that. And he says just because a hawk and an airplane both have wings doesn't mean that this is an angel. That's not enough to tie them together. So I was questioning, why is this priest not using this as proof, concrete evidence to support that there is a God? So if I believe this now my conspiracy, because it's not how it worked, if the priest was the one to identify this person as an angel to begin with, I think then he would have had the freedom to do so. But by accepting that this random woman was the identifier and she was correct means that there would be no reason for a priest to now have to exist. There now needs to be no middleman between the average person, human, and the divine being. We no longer need that connection. So I think that he's doing it to preserve his seat of power and not to help contribute to the theology or this religiosity of this town. And
Joey,
that's my whole thing. And
I
he's
appreciate
heretic.
that. Well, I will definitely buy into the wisdom of thinking about the woman who was more of nature and just woman on the street. She's going to tell you how it is. The
Mm,
learned priest is going to say, she can't be right. So we're going to say this didn't happen. There's also a character in there, the doctor, who examines the boy and the angel at the same time because they both got chicken pox, which I thought was very funny
mhm.
because I'm like, I don't think you get chicken pox from chickens. They spent a lot of time talking about they were in the hen house. And I'm like, I had chicken pox and I am certain I did not get it from a chicken as a child, right? I think this is something we all go through. But the doctor said that he's examining the man and the way that his wings were there. And he said it seemed so logical, the construction of this creature's
Mhm.
body. He was like, why don't all men have wings? So you have the local wisdom, you have the priest, you have science now and medicine saying, these wings look pretty useful. Why wasn't that part of the design of human beings? I just thought that was also an interesting thing to put into this story. Very, very curious. And the fact that they keep referring, like there's at least two places in the story that they refer to 3 days. And I think in the Christian story
The
of how
Trinity,
things
yeah.
happened, there's a lot to go with that. But it was also interesting that at one point we are struck by this notion that he endures all of this pain and torture and he's trying to just stick to himself and survive. And as you said, over this long, long, long time frame, he gathers up his strength and he sprouts some new feathers on his wings and he eventually takes to the skies and flies away. But the mom in the story, the mom and the wife, she watches him go. And I thought it was just so beautifully rendered. And I just want to read that part, Joey, because I thought if this is a story asking people to think about their faith and the origin of why they believe what they believe, I thought this was just an interesting ending. She went to the window and caught the angel in his first attempts at flight. They were so clumsy that his fingernails opened a furrow in the vegetable patch, and he was on the point of knocking the shed down with the ungainly flapping that slipped on the light and couldn't get a grip on the air. But he did manage to gain altitude. Elsa Linda let out a sigh of relief for herself and for him when she watched him pass over the last houses, holding himself up in some way with the risky flapping of a senile vulture. She kept watching him even when she was through cutting the onions, and she kept on watching until it was no longer possible for her to see him, because then he was no longer an annoyance in her life, but an imaginary dot on the horizon of the sea. And another side thing, Joy, I just wanted to say to you, during this exact time where he was writing this story, there was a Latin American government official who was ousted and thrown out of the country. And it was the first time that that had ever happened. So I questioned him and I looked that up because I'm like, I don't know anything about Latin American history. Was he comparing this decrepit creature with the enormous wings that could have allowed him to elevate? It kept him imprisoned, and then he flew away and suddenly had his freedom. I don't know. It was just an interesting thing to consider, and I would love to talk to some of my Latin American friends. What was the experience for a typical person leading through their government dissolving in their lifetime? What does that feel like, and how do you respond?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I didn't know about that, but I'm sure that that is something that inspired him, whether it was conscious or subconsciously. Sometimes it just comes out, as we have noticed when we talk about an author's biographical information, and then we are like, oh, yeah, I see where that came in.
But with the fact that he writes, and this just occurred to me, the fact that the angel now takes flight, that's a miracle in my book, right? That's a miracle. The miracle
Mm-hmm.
happened because this thing that stayed on the ground for 8 or 10 years or however long he was down there, one day just decided, today is my day, and off he went. And the fact that the author decides to put in there, it was nothing but an imaginary dot on the horizon. It's just an interesting choice of words, imaginary.
Yeah, and I think the impetus for the very old man with enormous wings to recover is, I think that's when he starts to actually be shown a little compassion, maybe not quite as much. Marquez writes that Paleo threw a blanket over him and extended him the charity of letting him sleep in the shed, and only then did they notice that he had a temperature at night and was delirious with tongue twisters of an old Norwegian. That was one of the few times they became alarmed, before they thought he was going to die, and not even the wise neighbor woman had been able to tell them what to do with dead angels. And yet he not only survived this worst winter, but seemed improved with the first sunny days. He remained motionless for several days in the farthest corner of the courtyard, when no one would see him, and at the beginning of December, some large, stiff feathers began to grow on his wings, the feathers of a scarecrow, which looked more like another misfortune of decrepitude. So I think that is when the morality part is, oh, well, now he can recover and fly off into the sunset because he's being shown some compassion finally. Not enough, okay, to be like, oh, here's a blanket, sleep in the shed, but it was enough to get him on his feet again.
Joey, that's an interesting angle that I did not consider, that the lesson to be learned wasn't the angel's lesson to learn. He didn't need to learn anything.
Mm-hmm.
He needed the people around him to grant him some grace, some compassion, some caring, to
Mm-hmm.
even be acknowledged. Because when we originally meet him, there's the question like, is he not? I don't know. They have this big spectacle. People are coming, they're paying money to witness him
Mm-hmm.
until the circus comes to town and there's a new act, right? There's something that took the attention of the community away from him. And he's like, I'm still here, still doing what I've always been doing, whether you watch me or not. And they said that the only person who did not participate in the act was the angel, right? The
Mm-hmm.
priest had something to say, the doctor had something to say, the people who were making the money and charging the tickets, the local townspeople who kept trying to prod him and to get him to stand up because they wanted to see what he looked like standing up. Like the fact that he existed wasn't enough. It's like, well, do something. And I think it reminded
Yeah.
me of the conversation we had about the paper menagerie about the Han Solo action figure. I'm like, well, what does it do? Does it just stand there or can it do something? And I think
Mm-hmm.
the people who are witnessing this angel, they're like, well, he's just kind of sitting there. Can you make him do something that's entertaining? Because we don't have the patience to figure this out. And I just thought that was very interesting, showing the tarantula girl who was a living morality tale, right? The reason she got
Mm-hmm.
turned into a spider is that they said as a young girl, she snuck out of the house and was dancing all night. And unbeknownst to her parents, that was very important. They're like, her parents did not know. She was definitely transgressing against social norms. And her punishment, a bolt of lightning came down and bzz, here she is, half spider, half ram, half girl. I know that's a lot of halves, but she's multifaceted, that character. But she
Yeah.
also was a performer,
Mm-hmm.
right? In this circus. They said that she would answer questions like, hey, you got a question about morality? I'm your girl. Just ask me a question. And that is when the attention shifted away from the angel. And I think that was also just a very interesting commentary, especially in the time frames that we are living in. This story was written in 1968, right? Before
Mm-hmm.
either of us were around. The fleeting nature of attention, concern, compassion, caring for people who are superficially interested in a topic is what, 1,000 times shorter than it may have been in 1968. And so I just thought that was also curious that that is something he put out there for us to contemplate.
And in that circus, there's a guy with bat wings that can fly. So we can again see that this is definitely magical realism because they're not even entertained by the guy with the bat wings. They're like we've never seen a guy with wings. Get out of here.
Yeah, we've already done that, right? And they said, oh, those
Yeah.
were bat wings. They weren't angel wings. So forget
Yeah.
about it.
We only like angel wings here. I would think bat wings would be really cool. Well, I guess a guy having wings or a person having wings would be cool in general. But anyway, what I think is probably the biggest takeaway, and obviously this is the thing that the angel or the very old man with the door with wings teaches us, is about human cruelty. And I think that's the lesson to be learned if you're going to read this to a child, or if you're an adult, you can still learn this lesson, that to see the indifference that the townspeople showed this very old man. I think it's that Marquez purposely writes him as an old man because this is someone that we would naturally, as a society, want to show compassion to and sort of protect, just like a child. It would be interesting if it was a child with very enormous wings, what would have happened then? But now it's an older man. So I think that was a very conscious decision for him to choose to create this character at this time of his life, and maybe it's an eternal life, because it seems kind of counter to what we would expect this society to they would react. They wouldn't put him in a chicken coop and let the hens peck out the parasites from his feathers. You would expect them to take him in and revere their elder of wherever he came from, but that's not what happens.
And Joy, it's so interesting that you say that because they also start the story with a newborn baby. We have a new baby and the old man, and they're both bald, right? And they both need care. And then their storylines overlap when they both get chicken pox at the same time. And then the kid goes to school and he's kind of written out of the story. And the man with enormous wings goes to the sunny place over the ocean, wherever he
Yeah,
returns,
oh
where he
yeah.
came from. You know, we talked a little bit about Greek mythology and Icarus and Daedalus
Hmm.
and flying too close to the sun, and all of that stuff was in there. I know we are reading a translation into English from the original
Hmm.
Spanish. So again, what role did the translator have in here? But there were a couple of instances, at least one for sure, where he talks about fate, that you will meet your fate. And I thought, isn't that interesting? What is the angel's fate? Is it to be shunned? Is it to be not believed? Is it to be missed when he's gone? We often say, I wonder what happened at the rest of the story, because wife who watched the angel fly away while she's chopping onions for her lunch, like she would do on any given day, will she be believed when she tells her husband or her son or the townspeople what happened, or will they no longer care? And I thought it was so interesting, Joey, the part that you read, that it was one of the few times they became alarmed, for they thought he was going to die, and not even the wise neighbor woman had been able to tell them what to do with a dead angel. And so the fear of responsibility, of consequence, of now what do we do? It was just very curious to me.
Yeah, I didn't think maybe the angel was trying to teach us the lesson. Then I wonder what would be the lesson to learn in this story if we were trying to learn it through the townspeople. I mean, I guess it would be the same thing that they eventually show it. They show compassion. Well, at least one person does. But yeah, I don't know. What is his fate? I think if we are thinking about it through that as a Christ-like figure where he was trying to absolve them of their sin, and if they were to show him a little compassion, he would flourish again and be able to move on, maybe to another city where he would feign illness for years until someone just shows him a little bit of care, put him in the shed with a blanket, do something, give him a meal. But yeah, that's it's interesting. And I have this theory that I know who he is. I know his true identity. I have a feeling maybe this is just me, but I think he might be Satan because he is described as having his huge buzzard wings, dirty and half plucked, were forever entangled in the mud. Now, that's hyperbolic, obviously, because you can wash mud off. But why say they were forever entangled in the mud? Is it because it's so caked on? You're like, this is going to literally take me forever. And you're supposed to think it's over exaggerated. Like I said, it's hyperbolic. Or is it because the mud he is dirtied, he is sullied, and that is a stain that will never come out? And he was kicked out of heaven, which might explain the darkness of the day. Maybe because it's March in the very beginning and, the day are short. That's my idea. It's Satan.
Joey, I love that you say that, because before our episode, I was like, I am not obviously a Bible scholar and I do not have a great deal of religious training. So I don't want to speak out of turn and I don't want to be disrespectful for those who hold this faith near and dear to their heart. So I'm like, what is an angel? Typed in my browser, what does the Bible say about angels?
Oh, it's like a
Now,
very different explanation. Yeah.
it is a
Mhm.
very clear, and then I went on a few other jaunts. They said it can be a physical manifestation sometimes. Mostly it is just a spirit that appears not physically, but just it's a feeling of a spirit. But it also could be a good angel sent by God, or to your point, it could be an angel that is also the devil. Like there are good angels and bad angels. And that did not occur to me as a person who is not ensconced in this religious tradition. And so for me, I could buy your version of the story. Of course I could. I do not know what Gabriel Garcia Marquez's affiliation or life philosophy was. I do not know enough about him. But this story for me on the outside made me question the veracity of the claims of religion. Are we poking holes into this? Is there something outside of the realm of an organized religion? I think that's why he had the priest in there saying, well, you don't know how to greet the priest. You don't know how to do the mass in Latin. So clearly you cannot be religious. And we have this lady of the more natural world, down to earth, saying, he's an angel, treat him with kindness. Maybe we don't keep him in a cage. Maybe somebody gives him a blanket. The more human elements, the human morality, which exists perhaps outside of organized religion, is a story we tell ourselves. And so when he says, he's an imaginary dot on the horizon, I'm like, why did you use the word imaginary? You could have said
Mhm.
unseen. You could have said disappeared out of my sightline. Like there's 100 things he could have said, but it's like, huh, super curious that you used that word imaginary. The larger meta message for me as a non-religious person is there are probably some amazingly wonderful things that happen inside organized religion, but in this story, organized religion or the rejection of that did not trump the indifference of the townspeople, of the caretakers or the lack of caretakers in the story. But I do appreciate, because there are things that are unexplainable phenomenon that happen in the world, and I have experienced that myself, not to the extent this woman has, obviously, but we get this beautiful image that she sees him take flight. We hear about the destruction he makes with his wobbly teetering like a toddler, like bumping into stuff, and then he finally takes flight, and she watches him with interest until he's no longer visible. And I just loved that imagery, even though I perhaps am not the target market for this.
I think if we talk about specific word choices, and yeah, it is very difficult when you're reading a translation and we're not obviously reading the primary text in its native language. But this reminds me of Juan Jose Ariola and the Switchman, because there's a very specific word that he used, dissolve. The Switchman dissolves into the scene there, or whatever, into the horizon. And that's very curious because that could mean a million things. And using the word imaginary is very specific. Was this a collective hallucination? What is it? Or did he actually fly away and she's sort of just like imagining that he's flying away, but is still stuck with this burden? When you're talking about the lack of morality from a religious source, even though they have a priest, and this seems like a very small town, so you would imagine that probably most of the population is going to church or whatever area that they would go for him to deliver sermons. So it's curious that he shows up and is only there to debunk that this is not an angel, which is a very scientific thing to do, is to say, using deductive reasoning, you are not an angel. I'm using logic to say you don't speak Latin, although why would an angel speak Latin? That makes no sense. If angels are created in the beginning of time, first of all, Latin's not that old compared to the beginning of time. Aramaic is much older, so if he's going to speak another language, it's probably Aramaic.
And that
But
was one of the questions, Joey, that they
yeah.
asked him when they were doing their interview. They're like, well, maybe it's Aramaic. Do you think that's it? And they're like, no, it's not that either.
It's like, oh, how well versed are you in Aramaic? But anyway, I think that's an interesting idea that there is just this lack of morality. And it seems like it maybe not a dig, but it's a criticism of religion, I thought, in this story. So I agree that he didn't do it by accident. He put that in there for a reason.
Joey, you used the term logic, and I want to take you to a part of the story where that is brought out in super clear detail. The doctor who took care of the child couldn't resist the temptation to listen to the angel's heart, and he found so much whistling in the heart and so many sounds in his kidneys that it seemed impossible for him to be alive. So again, that impossibility and the temptation to check it out. What surprised him most, however, was the logic of his wings. They seemed so natural on that completely human organism that he couldn't understand why other men didn't have them too. And Joey, there was a bit of humor. There was one line in this entire story that I laughed at, and I was like, that's kind of naughty. Like, that is blasphemy a little bit. I'm going to read that because I thought it was so interesting. So the angel is manifesting in various places in their house. They shoo him out of the kitchen. He shows up in the bedroom. They get rid of him. He's everywhere all the time. And they're like, this is so annoying. So it said he seemed to be in so many places at the same time that they grew to think that he'd been duplicated, that he was reproducing himself all through the house. And the exasperated and unhinged Alcienda shouted that it was awful living in that hell full of angels.
Yeah,
And I
that's
just
fun.
appreciate, I'm like, oh, you can't say those two things together. That's not in the rule book. I am sure of that. And it was an interesting thought. What does reproduce? You think you pushed him down in one spot and he popped up like it's like whack-a-mole, right? He is everywhere. And I thought, well, that's also curious, miraculous, magical, unexplained. And I appreciated that he called her, the mom, the wife, exasperated and unhinged. Unhinged is
Yeah.
a very specific and interesting word. So I just thought
Yeah.
that was very, very interesting. And then right after that, they're like, oh no, if he dies, what do we do with a dead angel? So again, it's responsibility. It's what will the neighbors think? What's the protocol? Instead of nurturing and appreciating this angel for who he is. At the end of the story, which we've already read, she was relieved that he flew away, both for herself to be free of this burden, but also happy that the angel could take flight and go. And so I also thought that was just a beautiful and realistic, selfish creatures, most of us, all of us, right, to some degree. And it's like, well, what's in it for me?
Yeah. Especially
value.
Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's so ironic because they're so annoyed by this angel, this very old man with enormous wing, but they profit off of him to such an extent that they can build, I'm pretty sure it's called a mansion. They're profiting off of this guy. They made a lot of money off of him and they still let him live in the chicken coop. So I think, again, another part of the morality of this story is what greed will do to a person. It will literally make you lose your morality and your humanity because you're so worried about making another dime. I know we're running out of time here, but I do think that ultimately what I'm going to walk away from is thinking like, what role does religion really play in this story? Because you would imagine that they're all still going to church all these years while this angel, I'm going to say he's an angel from above, a baby angel sent from above, that he's literally within their realm of being. They can just walk out and talk to him, ask him a question. Hey, what's God, what's God like? What kind of music does Jesus Christ like? But they don't acknowledge him. It's like, well, then what is the purpose of faith? If you meet the thing that you pray about, that you learn about and that you're reading about in the Bible, if you're come face to face with it and you don't acknowledge it and you don't appreciate it, then like what is the actual point? Is it just the practice of religion and not putting it into practice, just like going through the motions? What role does this actually play? Because it's not guiding them in any way that religion is meant to have done. And what would have happened if the priest did not discredit him as an angel? If this midwife lady came in, she obviously says that's an angel. What would have happened if that was not discredited and they were able to accept, okay, this is an angel, we should treat him with reverence, even if he was an angel? If you see someone that needs help, you should help them. So yeah, again, what are we supposed to take away from this? I'd be interested to someone that is Christian or Catholic, what they take away from this and what they think the moral of the story is. I think we would have the same moral, but like what role does religion play in this? Because it doesn't seem like it's painting it in a very good light. I mean, the leader of their faith in this area, obviously not the Pope, is not leading the way with compassion and reverence.